The sign on the pump said closed. The lights were off. The garage door was padlocked from the outside, and the padlock had rust on it, the way a padlock gets rust when it hasn't been touched in a while. It was October of 1960, and the high desert outside of Gallup, New Mexico, was the color of old copper in the late afternoon. The kind of place where men drove through without stopping, where the road kept going in both directions and the wind came off the mesa and didn't particularly care about anything it passed. A man in a canvas jacket had pulled a truck off the highway and was standing at the pump reading the sign. Here is the story. Hector Reyes had run those pumps for 9 years. Not his father's pumps, not his uncle's his. He had bought the station in 1951 with $1,400 he'd saved working road crew for the state of New Mexico. 3 years of laying asphalt in heat that came up off the ground and heat that came down from the sky at the same time. And he had paid the first note himself, and the second note himself, and the third note himself, and in 9 years, he had not missed one. The station sat at the junction of Route 66 and a state road that went up toward the reservation. It was not a glamorous location. The nearest town with a grocery was 18 miles. The nearest bank was in Gallup, 23 miles. But it was the only fuel for 40 miles of that highway, and truckers knew it. And Navajo families knew it, and the occasional car with California plates knew it when their gauge dropped lower than they'd planned for. Hector had a pit under the garage floor, where he did engine work when the pumping was slow. He had a hand-painted sign over the register that said open Sundays. He had a daughter named Rosa, who was 7, and a daughter named Claudia, who was 4, and a wife named Marta, who had worked the register on weekends for all 9 of those years. Marta had been sick since February. Not sick in the way that gets better in a week. Sick in the way that takes money, the way water takes sand steadily, without asking. The hospital in Albuquerque. The specialist they drove to twice. The prescriptions that cost what they cost whether you had the money or not. Hector had paid down what he could. He had borrowed against the station for the rest. The bank in Gallup had a man named Dunbar who handled small business accounts. Dunbar wore a pressed shirt every day and had a folder he carried the same way a doctor carries a chart, like he had seen this before, many times. And what was inside the folder was not news to him. He had driven out to the station in September with the folder on the seat beside him. He had been polite. He had explained the situation. He had given Hector 45 days. That was September. Hector had kept the station open through all of it. 45 days of the same thing, open at 6 in the morning, pump gas, do what work came in, close at 8, drive to the hospital twice a week, come back, do it again. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who explained himself to strangers. He had been running those pumps 9 years through weather and slow months and the summer of 1955, when the highway department rerouted traffic 6 miles south for 3 months of construction, and he had come through all of it with the same face. But when the 45 days were up and Dunbar came back with a different kind of document and the padlock in a paper bag, Hector had not argued. He had read what Dunbar put in front of him. He had signed where Dunbar pointed. He had watched the man lock the pump housing and leave the key on the counter and drive back toward Gallup. And then he had stood at the register for a while before he turned the lights off and walked out and locked the door with his own key. The key he had carried on his belt for 9, because the document said he had 3 days to surrender it, and he intended to do it properly. He had been back that afternoon to get a toolbox he had forgotten. He had left Rosa and Claudia in the truck. The pump on the east side of the island still had a handwritten paper taped to it that said Supreme 28 cents. It moved in the wind. There was no one else around. The road went east, and the road went west. And the mesa stood above all of it the way mesas do, which is to say without any opinion about what happens below. Hector was lifting the toolbox into the truck when the sound of another engine came off the highway. If you've ever watched something a man built get taken apart while he stood there and didn't say a word, drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The truck came off the highway slow and stopped at the pump island. The man who got out was large, wearing a canvas jacket and a battered tan Stetson with the road on it. He read the closed sign on the pump. He walked to the garage door and looked at the padlock. He stood there the way a man stands when he is doing math in his head and not liking the answer. Then, he looked across the lot and saw Hector. He walked over. Not fast. The way a man walks when the hard part of some previous thing is already behind him and the next thing has not yet required speed. He said, "Station yours?" Hector said it had been. The man looked at the padlock on the garage. He looked at the paper taped to the pump. He looked at the two small girls in the truck cab and then back at Hector. "Bank?" Hector said yes. The man took his hat off and looked at it for a moment, and then put it back on. "How much?" Hector told him the number. It was $3,200. The man didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the road going east, and then at the road going west, and then at the pump island with its hand-painted sign and its rust on the padlock. He looked at the garage door the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. He said, "I have a problem. I go through this stretch 6, 7 times a year. Crewing out of Durango, coming down through Gallup. There's 40 miles on this highway where there's nothing open." He paused. "You understand? I'm not doing you a favor. I'm fixing a road problem I have, personally." Hector said he didn't follow. The man took a check register from the inside pocket of his jacket. He uncapped a pen. He said, "Who do I make it to?" Hector said his name. Hector Reyes. The man wrote for a moment. He tore the check and held it out across the hood of the truck. It was for $4,000. The name on the check was John Wayne. Hector looked at it. He looked at the man. He said something that did not come. Wayne said, "The extra $800 is for the months you were driving to Albuquerque and back instead of pumping gas. That's a road cost. I'm covering a road cost." He said it the way a man states a fact of geography. "Get Dunbar to release the lien first thing Monday. I'll call ahead." He got back in his truck. He pulled back onto the highway heading east, and the sound of the engine went out, and then there was only the wind and the paper on the pump moving back and forth. And Hector Reyes stood at the edge of the pump island, holding a check in both hands, the way you hold something you're not sure is real, and Rosa and Claudia watched him from the truck and didn't say anything. Because children that age can tell when something has changed, and the right response is to be quiet about it. He read it again. His hands were steady. Hector Reyes opened the station on a Tuesday morning in November 1960 with a receipt from First National Bank of Gallup in his shirt pocket, showing the lien released in full. He had the closed sign off the pump before 7. The first truck pulled in at 7:15. He ran those pumps for 22 more years. He learned the diesel engine and the carburetor and the transmission work that the bigger rigs needed and that the next nearest shop couldn't do. And the truckers on that stretch of 66 knew his name and knew his hours and knew that if something went wrong between Gallup and Flagstaff, Hector's was the place. He expanded the garage in 1967. He put a second pump in on the west side of the island in 1971. He paid every note from that point forward without borrowing against anything. Marta recovered. It took most of 1961, but she recovered. She worked the register on Sundays until Rosa was old enough to spell her, and then she worked it on Saturdays too, because she said it was better than sitting. Rosa Reyes graduated from the University of New Mexico in 1975 with a degree in civil engineering. She went to work for the State Highway Department, the same department her father had laid asphalt for in the heat before he ever had a station of his own. She worked on road projects across New Mexico for 31 years. Claudia became a teacher in Gallup. She taught 4th grade for 27 years. She had a photograph on her classroom wall, not of John Wayne the actor, not a movie poster, just a photograph of the station in the morning light with the pumps running and her father behind the counter visible through the window. She did not always tell students the story behind it. But she kept it there every year, because she said some things in a room don't need explaining. Hector retired in 1982. He sold the station to a man from Albuquerque who kept the hand-painted open Sunday sign above the register, because he said it seemed like the kind of thing you didn't take down. There is a check register somewhere. Not the check that went to the bank in Gallup in November 1960 and was processed and cleared and filed and is gone the way check, but the register. The small leather-covered book Wayne kept in his jacket pocket turned up in an estate sale in Newport Beach in 2003. The page where the entry was made is still there. October 1960. $4,000. Written out to Hector Reyes in a hand that doesn't waste any movement. The afternoon light comes through the window of wherever that register is now, the way afternoon light comes through windows. The page holds the ink the way paper holds ink. What was written stays written. John Wayne never spoke of it. Not to his director. Not on set. Not in an interview, not in any letter anybody turned up, not to the men he worked with on the pictures he was making that year. No reporter ever got it from him. No biographer found a record of it in anything Wayne's. There are no notes about a gas station in New Mexico. No mention of a man named Hector Reyes. Nothing. What the story says about the man is what the story shows. He pulled off a highway in the high desert because his gauge said he needed fuel. He saw what had happened. He did the math. He made it about a road problem he had, because he understood that a man who has carried something for 9 years with his own hands does not need a stranger's charity. He needs a stranger who will find the way to make it not charity. That is a particular kind of intelligence. The kind that notices what the room has decided not to see. The kind that finds the phrasing that lets a man receive something without having to put down what he has been carrying. If you know someone who moved through the world that way, quiet, unannounced, without needing the story told back to them, share this with someone who ought to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be told. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne.